It's great to see all the people joining from all over the country. It's very exciting. Thank you, Teresa, for making this possible.
Oh, good morning, Wendy. Where is it? Is it night where you are?
It is 7:30 p.m. in Kaunas, Lithuania.
Well, welcome. Thank you for joining. We're good to start. Is that right? Yeah.
I think so.
So I just wanted to take a moment, Wendy, before I turn it over to Allison, who's the moderator, to thank you for being such an amazing sponsor of the Tri-State Conference for the past 3 years. Not only you personally, professionally being here, but the sponsorship of Galen Hope and Within Health. And as you know, I have deep gratitude to you and your team at Galen for the work that you did for a family member. So, again, just wanted to take 1 second to thank you. And I'm so looking forward to your talk. And I am going to turn it over to Allison, who's going to be your moderator. Right.
Thanks, Teresa.
Welcome. And so Allison Vorhall is going to be the moderator for today. And just like Amy's talk, put all of your questions into the Q&A and be active on the chat. And I will turn it over to Allison.
Thank you, Teresa. All right, good morning, everyone. But we're going to start with Dr. Wendy Oliver-Pyatt. She is a world-leading expert on treating eating disorders. With more than 25 years of clinical experience, she has developed 5 distinctive treatment programs, all grounded on a strong biopsychosocial foundation and incorporating intensive psychotherapy with behavioral foundations and high medical standards. Wendy has developed a unique treatment approach that delves into the underlying issues that place a person at risk for mental health conditions and eating disorders and lead to healing, health, and inner peace. So without further ado, I'll pass the baton to Wendy. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. And Teresa, thank you. And the family member you mentioned was a blessing to work with. So thank you for that opportunity. I have given this talk a few times and I have evolved, just like the evolution of shame. I have evolved the talk. Had a lot of different ideas about this over the past week or so. So with that said, we can go to the next slide. And this is a bit of the overview. I am going to kind of race through those first 4 sections. I will make my slides available. And also at the end of the slide, you are going to see our email addresses. So if we don't get to things in the Q&A, please email us. We want to hear from you. We want to connect. And if you have any ideas, feedback, or questions about the talk, or critiques, hopefully they'll come through a lens of compassion, but we would love to hear feedback as well. But anything at all, please do email us. We sincerely want to hear from you. So on to the next slide. So I am very interested in this subject of shame. I was telling the ladies prior to us starting, when I had an eating disorder, I was about 15 years old. I had decided I binged on something, I probably like a piece of candy or something, and I thought, oh my God, catastrophe. And I felt all this shame. And I have an older brother who is autistic, and I was describing the shame, and he just looked at a very practical way at me and he goes, shame sucks. And I was like, yeah, it kind of does suck. Now there are there's some writing about what healthy shame is, and I decided not to go too much into that today, but what is really interesting to me is that shame is really, I think, one of the core emotions that drives a lot of just different destructive behavior. It's a very painful experience, and it's a ubiquitous experience. When I've given this talk in person, I've actually done an experiential where people wrote down things they felt ashamed about and threw it up to me at the front of the stage, and we got to read it out loud anonymously and kind of have this shared experience of how ubiquitous it is and how common it is. But I think it affects different people differently for different reasons. But it's been around for a long time, and the word actually comes from scamu or skiomu, and it kind of has to do with the painful feeling of guilt or disgrace It's talked about in the earlier writings as it causing confusion. And I think that's linked, my theory is that's linked to dissociation, a state of being disgraced. Notice that word state, dishonor, loss of reputation, loss of esteem. And in the positive light, it can also be talked about with modesty, but it's a really painful emotion, and we all know that. In Darwin's 1872 book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, is the first pioneering study of emotion. And according to Paul Ekman, his view is that this should be considered the book that began the science of psychology. So it's kind of interesting and fascinating to me to think about. We talk about psychology, obviously, unless most of us are clinicians, we talk about psychology in everyday life, but until 1872, there really was no study of emotion. Imagine that. Nobody knew the word emotion, the study of emotion didn't even exist. It was Darwin who did that. So Darwin gets a lot of credit for certain things, but people don't know this about him. And this was something I found particularly fascinating. Next slide. He talks about some different things that had to do with expression of emotion. This is kind of a little bit tangential to shame, but this I thought is kind of interesting to just think about this. So he talked about three things. And I think it shows up in our work in different ways. So I think it has some utility. So he talks about the principle of serviceable, what he calls serviceable associated habits. And what that means is when any action has been useful or necessary under a certain state of mind, it will, from association, continue to be performed whenever that state of mind recurs, right? Even if it's no use. A really good example of that is that when dogs are like going to lay down, how they go in circles and circles and circles when they lay down to sleep. And that is that they're in the state of mind that they were in as they continued to evolve when they were first laying down in fields and hiding and digging. So it's the same emotional state of I'm going to sleep and rest, but they're here, there they are in your carpet digging and going in circles. So that's the serviceable associated habits. And I think if you think about it, you can think about what happens with our patients with that. The next is antithesis, which is basically that the person will, as far as possible, behave in exact opposite of when certain attitudes bring about one condition. So, for example, when a cat is really comfortable with you and feeling relaxed, they're going to rub up to you and have their body in a certain position, which is sort of the opposite of when they're scared and ready to attack. So it's the antithesis. So we behave in ways that are sort of opposite of what we deem necessary in other certain situations. That idea of flipping the switch. Um, and then the last is this principle of actions is just really due to the nervous system. We see this a lot in trauma, that our body is going to do certain things when we feel certain emotions, whether it's practical or not. For example, if I give a talk, I might be more likely to stutter a little bit, or I'm pretty sure my heart rate is elevated right now. It's just my physiology doing that. And it doesn't really, for me, it doesn't serve a purpose. In fact, it kind of takes me out of my mind-body connection a little bit. So it doesn't really help. But those were things that Charles Darwin discovered. And I just thought that that'd be worth sharing because it's really mind-blowing to think that that's really when, emotions were first talked about. And you didn't start to notice the emotion of shame and what it kind of looked like on people. So we noticed blushing, eyes turning from side to side, looking down to the ground. You can go to the next slide. And this slide sort of captures it here. The lips get lower, downward head movement, covering the body, closed posture, blushing of cheeks. So he was starting to really notice there was these physiological aspects of emotions. So the next slide. And then, and more recently, Teresi on the origin of shame started to write about what is shame about and what is it around? Why is it around? Why has it lasted evolutionarily over all this time? So it's thought that many have suggested that shame performs important adaptive functions in terms of the maintenance of social norms and quote unquote moral behavior. Fessler postulated that the function of shame is to regulate social systems and hierarchies. And shame is responsible for the aversive effects of social rejection. I think that really ties in with weight stigma and why eating disorders are so severe, because it's that experience of social rejection that's tied in with shame that is extremely painful. And in the end of this talk, which I should have said in the very opening, is that I actually added a few slides to address how our current political climate may also be affecting all of us and our patients with regard to shame and how this is tied in with social order per se. So next slide. The most common view of shame is that it's an intensely negative emotion directed at the self as a result of having failed to live up to some standard ideal or norm. So obviously in our society where with normative discontent, which is sort of normative internalized shame, right? Normative discontent is the normalization of food and body preoccupation, a term coined, I can't remember by who, but many years ago, but it's really normative internalized shame. Um, and really that shame is heteronomous, which means that it's based on external values. So what my boys in Nigeria didn't, when they moved to, I have adopted kids that came to America, they would throw garbage on the ground. That was just normal to them. And I was like, oh my gosh, so that it's the idea that it's subject to external values. So it's important to think about, that's the most common value concept, that it's very tied with social norms, which is why eating disorders are biopsychosocial conditions. Shame is, next slide, shame is largely about failing to public norm standards and ideal, according to Heidi Mabom, who wrote The Descent of Shame. And so she talks about it as a group-oriented view of shame, and it's largely about failing to live up to public norms and standards. And shame appeases social others and reconfirms to them the social commitments to the person ashamed. Like, I'm committed to you. I'm ashamed because I didn't stand up to your norms. And it can also be feature an audience. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. Why does this matter so much? Because this is so often the buried emotion that's driving destructive behavior. And I think understanding these nuances of its history and why it's there can help just have thoughts in our mind that can help drive compassionate, inquisitive conversation and be even a subject for discussion, even in an analytical and academic way with patients. I think patients seeing shame as something that's been around for a long time, that's ubiquitous, and really talking about it in this analytical way can sort of, and in a compassionate way, can help take some of the grip of shame off. I know it really has done that for me. So distinguishing shame, you can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, back. Sorry, I'm Rebecca. So shame kind of drives this self-evaluative ruminations. The self is perceived as innately flawed, and there's a negatively valent self-conscious emotion. And I just want to point out that this idea of the self-evaluative rumination. So we see when people have things like OCD, which can reinforce rumination, or if they have major depression, which can reinforce just the view on things and through a negative lens. So you can sort of see when a person has a propensity to shame or is in a biopsychosocial atmosphere that reinforces shame, and then some other co-occurring biological aspect to their mental health, such as OCD, I'll use in this example, it can also be trauma. You can see how it's very synergistic. 1 + 1 does not equal 2. It's much more intense than that for folks. Next slide. So there's also some other causes of shame that have some different categories. But it's thought of as a failure to live up to etiquette norms, like being polite, wearing the appropriate attire. Like if I came to this meeting and I was like, maybe had my hair in a ponytail and I was wearing a bathing suit, I probably wouldn't seem right to this group, right? Moral norms can be, failure to live up to moral norms. And so that's one of the ideas, that there can be this, what we call healthy shame. We think of shame in such a negative light, but there's healthy shame as well. And then the personal standards and ideals is where we see so many eating disorders sort of inflappable, that, effortless thinness that was really pushed upon us through through media, starting back when it all came about. The extreme thinness was really getting a lot of attention, sort of in the 70s and 80s. Being the best, I remember Jenny Kramer's book, Life Without It. I remember one of the lines, and it was really funny, but also really serious. And the line was, congratulations, Janie. Congratulations, Jenny. You're the thinnest one on the elevator. I remember, I don't know if that was in a book or she told me that was like a thought that she had. So being the best at being the eating disorder patient, which we so often see. And this is something to really inquire about in therapy, obviously on the foundation of connection and compassion and a strong relationship. But these kind of things can be very, very helpful. Next slide. So there is this conversation about the role of an audience. That not any audience can necessarily make someone feel ashamed. It must be a group of peers or respected others, or even simply a social group that the person is a part of. Certainly when you have medical doctors, telling kids to lose weight or take Ozempic, that's a social, situation where there's this other source of strength and a source of credibility, at least in most people's minds, really imparting on a person that you're just really not okay the way you are, and drastic measures must be taken. The audience can be real. You can go to the next slide. The audience may be real, or they could be an imagined audience, but there's the notion that there's the audience that really matters. And then there's the agent-centered view of theme. So that concept from Heidi Maybaum is that let's say I won't feel the shame unless I hold the same values, right? I'm not going to feel shame unless I hold those values. And actually, that's one of the things that can help a person really recover, is saying, this value of the pursuit of thinness, this value of diet culture, this value around stigmatization, that's not my value. So it's not gonna affect me anymore. This is what the agent-centered view of shame is about, that I'm different and I don't have to have these different values. So that can be helpful in helping somebody differentiate. A group center is different, though. It's really about the shame being based on what the group is saying to the person. So it's really about the group. What a person is a function of their social position and standing. And it's all in the eyes of the community, and the self-esteem is fully sensitive to this self-esteem of others. So this is like there's no agency. It's all what the group says. And I believe that there's probably some differences in the brains of people who are more vulnerable to eating disorders, that they may have a harder time discerning this and sort of saying, I'm going to be agent-based. And the sense of the group-centered view of shame is really just very overwhelming to them. So they could sit there in therapy and talk with you about it, but that sense of shame is still going to come about. So these are theories on shame, and different patients may have different propensities towards the ability or inability to navigate this kind of thing. The next slide, there's, of course, a lot about shame and morality. Recalcitrant shame is that I feel shame about something even if I don't actually agree with the views. So, for example, if someone who believes that in the right to abortion, but if they themselves have to have an abortion, they end up feeling shame. So they don't believe that abortion is something to feel ashamed about, but they still are feeling that shame, even if it's in conflict with their value. And that can also happen. And people may, come up with this, like, you have an eating disorder patient, like, I don't believe in diet culture. I don't want to feel this internalized weight stigma, but they're still struggling with shame when they eat, for example, or shame about their body size and shape. They can know very well theoretically something is not in alignment with their values. And our patients go through this a lot, which is why, I remember when I was first treating eating disorders, I always thought, what's wrong with me? Why do I have to say the same thing over and over? Well, it's because people need to hear things many times in many ways. And now with IFS and expressive therapies and somatic therapies and EMDR, there's lots of other ways to get into that person. Next slide. It is definitely, we can go to the next slide. Sorry. So shame is also, Kaufman describes it as feeling painfully deficient, painfully diminished. And that's just another concept to kind of keep in mind. Next slide. Um, some other kind of side notes about shame is that in looking at the history of shame going way, way back, we know that there's certain bodily concerns that bring around shame. Why do we feel embarrassed to maybe go to the bathroom in public, or do we not feel comfortable with somebody seeing us throw up, for example? So it's thought that the evolution of having shame associated with these bodily functions may have actually been tied to a disease avoidant architecture that evolved. So when we were sick or we were defecating or urinating and those sort of things, we feel this shame around these bodily functions, and it may have evolved from our being attempting to avoid the spread of disease. So I thought that was very interesting, but it's also playing out with our eating disorder patients with this disgust, shame experience that so many of our patients do have, which is so overwhelming and so powerful and may have this deep evolutionary foundation. It kind of helps explain why eating disorders are so damn hard to overcome. Then there's another shame anger connection. So anger and rage can be a secondary reaction to shame, and that serves to insulate and protect the self against further exposure by alienating others. So it's important to remember, I try to remind myself and people I work with, like when that patient is yelling at you and screaming at you and quitting therapy and says they're firing you and all that stuff, they might seem like they're some, unhinged person or whatever, but that anger is really a representation very often of the shame. And if we keep that in our back pocket, we can breathe, we can calm down, and we can really be there for our patients and loved ones, and even for ourselves. So with shame and body image, we know that, as crazy as it is, this quote unquote attractiveness contributes to social standing. So people are so caught up with body image because they literally feel in our effed up society that they're going to lose social standing. And so often when you talk with patients, they're just trying to get equal footing. They're trying to be able to have an equal opportunity. And there's this demotion that's tied with this bias and diet culture that is so sickly affecting our culture. Next slide. It's important just to distinguish shame and guilt. So shame is really about the self as a whole. Like my being is bad. It's a moral, self-directed a moral judgment upon ourselves. It's very judgy. And guilt is more about a shortcoming, a behavior that we did wrong. So it's less generalized and it's more specific to a behavior. And then there's the concept of shame culture and guilt culture. And I think we're living in a shame culture right now for sure when it comes to our basic need to eat and to exist in the body that God or whatever higher power there is gave to us. Next slide. And so there's the difference between I'm a bad person or I did a bad thing. Next slide. So there's also just one little side note that I think is really interesting to talk about, which is altruism and shame. So altruism is also a genetically mediated trait. And those people who have this mediation towards altruism may also be those that are likely to feel shame when they're taking care of their basic needs. So I talk a little bit about this because there's so many people with eating disorders who are innately very altruistic. They may also be very prone to shame. I think the experience of shame in the face of taking care of your needs, right, which is altruistic folks have a harder time attending to their needs. They may even have less interoceptive awareness and other tendencies. And I do believe that in folks with eating disorders, when you see the vegetarianism that so often, it's really important to discern whether the vegetarianism is based on the eating disorder or is this really an innately altruistic human that has high shame. I know one patient said to me, like, if I eat chicken, I feel like there's a chicken inside of my stomach. And so that's just a really important thing to think of. And then also to discern with guilt also and taking up space for people that have survived whether overt or covert abuse or trauma, there is that guilt that can translate into I don't deserve to be here. I don't deserve to take up space. So just some little nuggets for you all to think a little bit about. I just put some quotes in throughout here, just like kind of thoughts to share of mine along the way. So in case they're helpful, the moment we meet our shame with curiosity, and I know Rebecca will talk about that, I'm sure, curiosity instead of criticism, something powerful happens. We begin to see that our most hidden parts were only there trying to protect us. So I know you guys are going to talk about protectors as this continues on. Just a few little things about weight stigma here. I think this audience is quite aware of weight stigma, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But I do want to emphasize that what weight stigma is about, it's about internalized attitudes toward body size that affects how those who are the targets are treated. So internalized, that's the word. And that's a hard thing to overcome, right? It's an internalized aspect of how somebody is viewing something. And this results in prejudice, discrimination, and a devalued social identity. This is a painful experience for somebody to endure. And we are there to help people through this, no doubt. But when weight stigma actually interferes with a person's ability to meet their basic needs, we have serious problems here, and that's why we're all here working with eating disorders. Next slide. We do know that weight stigma is on the rise, and the number one perpetrator of weight stigma is families, and the number two is doctors. So we know that more than 50% of adolescents in 2021 reported increased exposure to weight stigmatizing social media contact during the pandemic. And we also see the high rise in kids that are hospitalized for eating disorders. And I certainly remember during the pandemic, all the adolescent programs that were full and had wait lists of 3 to 6 months. And that was no surprise. And that was, I think, connected with weight stigma. Next slide. We won't spend a lot of time on this because we will go ahead and send all of these slides. But the important point here is that there is a propensity towards weight size-based bullying. We need to be very proactive and protective of individuals. 25% of kids reported they'd been bullied anyway. And also parents tend to be more knowledgeable than teachers about if their kids were bullied. So you can't just count on the teacher to see it. We have to ask kids. We have to ask the kids that we're treating. I remember when I first changed my intake questionnaire for one of my treatment centers where the first time I added, have you ever been exposed to bullying? And that was like kind of a breakthrough thing, but I mean, we should all be asking that now. And weight status is a predictor of being bullied, and we need to ask about it because it's definitely going to affect people's ability to move through this. Stigmatizing experiences don't lead to health. I remember I gave a talk a really long time ago, and it showed something that the US government put out, which showed a woman in a body, and then it was kind of showing her body lines out, getting smaller and smaller, and saying, you know, how as she got smaller, she was getting healthier. You know, this was something the US government put out. So we have to remember that authoritative social institutions are really perpetrating shame, and it's not actually helping people be any more propensity towards taking good care of themselves. It actually increases caloric intake. It causes sleep disturbances, alcohol abuse, higher risk of suicidality, worse health outcomes, and not going to the doctor, which is a big thing for certain social groups. Next slide. Brene Brown did a survey around what people felt shame about, and she said that her survey, 90% of people reported actually experiencing body shame, which is just absolutely insane to think of. Next slide. You can keep going to the next slide. And these are some of the other things that people reported feeling shame about in Brene Brown's study. So this is a lot of different areas that people do experience shame, and there's certainly more, but all 200 reported experiencing shame in one of these categories, all 200 of them, but 90% of them reported shame around body image. And we're going to talk a little bit about, I mean, look at this one, aging. I can certainly relate to that. I just turned 60, religion, ability to speak out for self. So these are all things we need to ask about with our patients. Next slide. And unhealthy shame can come about from a lot of different kinds of trauma, not just overt trauma, abandonment through abuse, sexual abuse, emotional shame binds, narcissistic deprivation, which is really the emotional experience of not receiving the validation, the mirroring, and affirmation that one needs. Fantasy bonds. I think we all went through that at some point or another in our 20s, where we had that relationship that we just saw all the potential and just had that delusion that it was going to come to fruition, right? So, but all of these things can be shame inducing. This part of the talk, I'm just going to touch on basically the interpersonal needs that we have, and how when we have our interpersonal needs and our needs are not met, Kaufman talks about that causing shame binds. So these are things that we can sort of look for in our patients. We get into binds when we experience needs and our needs are not met by that other. And this is also tied in with self-psychology, but I think self-psychology is really, really connected to IFS too. You can see a lot of the overlaps, but I won't go down my Kohut self-psychology road today because I get really excited about that. But I love these needs. I've put them up on so many slides because it just captures like what we need. We need to feel loved and wanted. And we have shame when we don't experience that in a relationship. We need to be able to touch and hold. We have shame when touching is withheld or abusive. I remember one of my first patients was telling me how she fell on a bicycle and she was crying on the curb, and she was talking about like how she wanted her mom to pick her up, and her mom just, God bless her mom, whatever her trauma was, but her mom was really like pissed at her for, crashing the bike. And this person had a really strong need for touching and holding, which showed up in a lot of different ways. Kids need that personal culture, like that a parent kind of gives off. This is who I am. This is what I believe. This is what I do. That they bring your kid to work day. Like kids need to feel like they're a part of something. Sometimes religion can give that. There can be a lot of different avenues in, but kids need that differentiation. We see the need for differentiation show up so often in our patients. And when there's trauma, a lot of times that differentiation is really, really hard because people are hanging on to each other for dear life. But I needed to, at some point in my life, be able to differentiate from my parents and develop my own life. And my kids need to do the same thing. And it's hard when you're a parent and they're not calling me for everything anymore. They're just doing it. And that's a part of it. But a lot of our patients, we see the difficulty there. The other interesting thing is that we need to be able to nurture also. We not just to receive, but also to give. And I know my kids, when they were little, they always used to want to do my hair and things like that. And they still like to, one of my kids likes to put makeup on me, and I'm always like, oh, too much makeup. But I'm like, okay, let's go ahead and do it. But if we reject that, that causes a fraction of the interpersonal bridge. An affirmation, the need to be valued, to feel worthwhile and enjoyed, and shame comes from non-acceptance. Rebecca, I'm going to go ahead and move us on to just keep moving along. I want to send all these slides out to everybody, and I just want to go to the next set of slides that's going to talk about the political climate. You can just keep going. I always do this, guys. I always make too many slides. This was really disciplined of me. I actually cut out like 20 slides, and I need to work on that. But anyway, I'm going to try not to feel shame about it. I wanted to talk a little bit about the current political climate and how it may be affecting our patients, and our own experience of shame. And this is just a little bit before Rebecca goes into her part. I just wanted to share this because I thought, the title of this talk was like, why do we need this now? And I wanted to give us a little bit of a framework around talking about how the political climate now may affect shame. So next slide. So framing the issue, we talked already about shame doesn't happen in a vacuum. social political systems shape internalized messages about worth and belonging. We have a lot happening right now about worth and belonging in our society. As proprietors, we can help clients locate shame in both the personal and the political. And I think you guys all know what I'm talking about, of people feeling like they have worth and belonging, and how that can be really getting turned upside down these days. Polarization, next slide, polarization and identity-based shame. So there can be pressures to choose sides, and that can actually cause a fragmentation of the self. Using IFS language, parts may not feel enough of any identity or ashamed of changing their views. And the IFS note is that polarization mirrors internal conflict between parts. Next slide. So much of shame is about secrecy. When we speak it aloud in the presence of compassion, we break the spell. We become free to relate to ourselves differently. Next slide. So calling out culture and moral perfectionism, a fear of making mistakes can lead to silence and disconnection. Performative activism may come from our protector parts. We feel like we have to. The clinical insight there is to normalize imperfection, locate shame in the context of the political climate. Maybe I feel shame because I didn't go to the march, or I don't necessarily agree with what everybody is saying around me. And that leads to the isolation there. So state-sanctioned shame, next slide, really talks about policies that target gender identity, body autonomy, poverty, and immigration. And we see that happening a lot. The systemic shaming messages do potentially come internalized for human beings potentially experiencing any of these. And some of the times, a lot of the times, as my dear Shavis Turner would point out, there's a lot of intersectionality there a lot of times. And we've talked about this already. Trauma is cultural and collective. It's not just individual. So we're all experiencing this, but certain populations are experiencing it a lot more. Next slide. Next slide. Shame as a social control. Oh, I'm so sorry. Back. Thank you. Sorry about that. Shame as a social control is used to dehumanize, maintain power, and discourage dissent. The therapeutic implication is that we have to unpack this inherited political shame, which, my God, many of these people already have shame or trauma and shame from so many other domains. But now within our culture and within our society, we're adding another very big dose of shame. Next slide has to do with collective shame, grief, and fatigue. We might have shame about our privilege. I know sometimes I feel that way. I have shame about my privilege. Sometimes I have shame about I'm not being active enough. I'm not doing enough. Am I being complicit in so doing? It can definitely lead to burnout, numbing, and disconnection. I've actually literally now twice had dreams about things happening politically, actual dreams. And so I'm like, wow, this is really affecting me. So we can reframe this with compassion and responsibility, but not condemnation. The clinical application, next slide, is to invite clients to name the political and cultural shame. You can use IFS to explore inherited beliefs or the exiled identities. Therapists must explore their own internalized messages as well. I did want to include, next slide, a comment about shame and financial struggle. Poverty and financial insecurity are often framed as personal failures rather than systemic issues. People experiencing financial hardship may internalize messages that they are irresponsible, lazy, or unworthy. I know I felt like that when I was kind of pretty low on resources. I felt ashamed. I remember times when the ATM, I went there and I didn't have any money, and I was wondering if anybody could see that the ATM didn't work. And certainly I'm quite privileged relative to most. And I remember that very well. Social systems frequently link worthiness to productivity, income, and consumption. Shame may prevent individuals from seeking help, support, or connection, fueling that isolation. Parts, as you talk about in IFS, may carry intense burdens of secrecy, self-blame, and fear of judgment. From the IFS perspective, exiles may hold beliefs like I'm a burden or I'm not enough. Next slide. I also wanted to include a slide about shame and gender nonconforming identities because of, again, what's happening in our political climate. And current political rhetoric and legislation often targets trans and gender expansive individuals, as we know. Messages from media, law, and institutions may frame gender diversity as deviant and dangerous. These external narratives become internalized by parts, creating toxic shame and a sense of wrongness, which is horrible. Gender nonconforming people may experience rejection by families, community, or faith groups, which deepens the shame. Shame may show up as dissociation, hypervigilance, people pleasing, which we see a lot of, and chronic self doubt. The IFS lens has that exiles may carry trauma from invalidation, while protectors attempt to mask, conform, or disappear. Next slide. Shame tells us to hide. But healing asks us to turn toward what hurts with love, with honesty, and with the belief that no part of us is beyond redemption. Shame and religious identity, we're going to be wrapping up in just a minute. This is something that's really tricky right now in our society. Political narratives and media often portray certain identities through a lens of suspicion, conflict, and extremism. Individuals may feel pressure to hide or distance themselves from visible signs of their faith to avoid judgment and discrimination. Collective blame for political events or international conflicts can be internalized, creating shame around identity. Rhetoric that positions religious values as backward and dangerous fosters internal conflict and erodes that belonging. Shame may manifest as, again, hypervigilance, withdrawal, and internalized self-hatred. The IFS lens says that exiles may hold pain around culture to ensure fear of being seen, while protectors work to shield the system from harm. So I will leave you with a reflection that you can potentially, we'll send this to you, that you can work on potentially with yourself or with your clients, which could give patients a chance to share around political, cultural message that are affecting shame, and can talk about parts. And next slide. There's some of the key takeaways that shame is also political, structural, and collective. And IFS and trauma-informed work can support that nuanced healing, and de-shaming political pain fosters agency and integration. Next slide. Even in its most innocent form, shame shows up when we fear we've disappointed others. What matters is how we respond, with punishment or with connection.
The first one was, could you share more about some experiences of, quote, spending a lot of time with managers to build trust? Sometimes I can feel like an interview facilitator. Are there prompts you find helpful in this process?
So one way I would approach that, just kind of like using that white wall, would be when you focus in on that part, how do you feel towards it? And then that's going to give you a sense of how blended the part or the person might be with that part, or how much self energy the person might have. And then if you have one of those C words that come in, I'm feeling kind of curious, or I'm feeling kind of, I'm feeling really aggravated towards it, or I just want that part to go away. Those last two statements would be, all right, there's not a lot of self there. So just saying, it makes a lot of sense that you have that aggravation towards that part, but just see if you can get that aggravated part to relax for a second, so that you can focus back in on that white wall, and just kind of like sussing out until you get one of those C words. And if not, doing some direct access with that manager, just speaking directly for it. Like, would it be possible to ask that part, what it's afraid would happen if it didn't do this for you? And you ask that part how long it's been functioning in this way for you. And that would be if you're able to get some self energy going on, or doing some direct access with it. So that's probably how I might spend a little bit more time with the managers to build trust. And really the goal is for the client to be able to have enough self energy to build up that trust with the manager before going to the exiles.
We can pop into our next one if we're ready. Someone asked, do all parts have a polarized part? I have clients where there is a part with a very strong belief, but there isn't a polarization. How do you see this? Oh, and actually, this is a second question, so we'll leave it at that one. Do all parts have a polarized part?
I think sometimes with younger kids, and or with adolescents, sometimes I'm talking more in parts language versus going in and doing like IFS, just saying, can we talk about that part of you that's really, afraid to gain weight right now? Can we just talk about that part and be curious about where and how that part kind of took on that belief or those burdens? And so just kind of talking in parts language can sometimes be helpful with some younger clients, but younger clients too, like even doing like if you work with little ones, um, or middle little ones, but like doing sand tray or doing play therapy and externalizing parts can also be really helpful.
All right. So is there a way of understanding or explaining the part that is nostalgic for the eating disorder when the person is further into recovery, such as behavior or thought free for a while, but then the nostalgia comes up unexpectedly?
I think, and Kelly, also, I think that's a really great question. And sometimes there's that longing for the protective nature of the eating disorder. And so it might be that there's a period of time where there's recovery, but then something really stressful might be going on. And there's that urge or that sense of wanting kind of the relief of the purging or the numbing of the binging or the numbing of the restricting that can come in. So I think that could be another aspect of that. And these are really great questions that I'm seeing coming up in the Q&A.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
probably have one more time for one more, Allison.
Yeah, personally, I really like this one. How do you work with clients who are unable to locate parts somatically? For example, I feel stuck when working with a client who reported not being able to notice body sensations. And I personally see this a lot with neurodivergent folks, right? Who just experience all body sensations a little bit differently. And again, it feels like a curious place. So any thoughts?
Teresa, I saw you do a big nod, and I would love for you if you want to start that.
Sure. Yeah, I think that if any of you were on the talk last night with Dick, he talked about not being able to see a part, that he can sense it. And so it's kind of like the opposite of that, where for me, I'm much more visual. So um, instead of feeling it in your body, you can ask that part, do you sense it? It doesn't even have to be, do you feel it in your body? Do you sense it? Sometimes it might be around your head or kind of have an image of it. And so those are two different ways, just sensing versus like, where do you feel that in? And the way that Dick would say it is like, how do you, sometimes he'll say, how do you feel or how do you sense that part in or around your body?
Mm,
Okay.
I love that.
Love it. I'm going to try and squeeze one more in, or you want to? Okay. Okay. Can we speak to protectors that also become managers if exiles get continuously triggered? And what would that look like in an eating disorder case? I think Dick yesterday mentioned that would look like, for example, dissociation becoming a constant if someone is constantly triggered. I'm curious to what this might look like with ED behaviors.
I think another example of that might be where if there's maybe a history of like binge eating that's there, but that gets kind of contained. There's more restrictive or binge eating disorder going on. Lots of different like aspects of the eating disorder. It's kind of like a continuum, can be protectors that are protecting exiles. And so one of the things that we were talking about last night is how those eating disorder behaviors go from extreme behaviors to more of like everyday manage, like it's just like the rituals like can become very managerial, the eating disorder rituals at the table. And it might be that someone has really been working on healing those exiles. Maybe they're a college student or something, and or even they're adults and they're getting ready to go back to like a high school reunion where there might be some bullies there, and there might be a certain level of recovery that's been done with the exile, but then all of a sudden those eating disorder symptoms come back up because those exiles are being triggered by going back into that environment. So that might be a time when you see some of those protectors come back in.
Yeah.
So those
Yeah.
are really great questions, and we'll try to, as we continue to go on through the day and through tomorrow too, if we didn't get to your questions, be sure, I think Allison, you might have caught them and can
Yep.
get them to Nancy.
Yep.
Yeah.